We were bullying people into these concepts. It was an ideological bullying across the medical spectrum.
In 2018, Jamie Reed started work as a case manager at a pediatric gender center. But after witnessing firsthand the irreversible harms of so-called gender-affirming care on children, she decided to blow the whistle.
At the end of the day, in these centers, nobody was the responsible one. The therapist would write a letter thinking that the endocrinologist was making the decision. The endocrinologist would say, but the therapist wrote the letter. And then they would all go and say, but the parents are making the decision. I worked in an industry that was harming children. And the thing that I have to grapple with every day is trying to address the wrongs that I participated in.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellett. Jamie Reed, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you so much.
Well, it's been about a year almost now since you announced that you're going to blow the whistle on the pediatric gender clinic at Washington University. And my goodness, a lot has happened since then. Why don't you tell me, for starters, a little bit about what it's like to become a whistleblower in this field?
Surprisingly, it's been very positive. There is a great cultural moment in time where this is a topic of huge interest to the American public. And there are so many thoughtful, intelligent people who are discussing this, debating this, and having courageous conversations every day. And I've been really welcomed into this network and circle of people.
So as I understand it, the clinic is now closed. So that's been a significant change,
yes,
right?
Yes. It was a bit of a process. So in the state of Missouri, they did introduce some legislation. The similar legislation had been introduced for a few years previous to my whistleblow. But after that occurred, the legislation was working through, and the state of Missouri passed a law to impose a moratorium, a 4-year moratorium, on any new pediatric patients starting a puberty blocker, cross-sex hormones, or having surgery. And there was a grandfather clause in. So basically anyone who had already been on these treatments could continue. But one of the things that the legislature did is they increased the limit of time that somebody could sue if they were harmed by treatments. So in most states, this is really limited. It's maybe 1 or 2 years. So they increased the limit of time, and just that fear of liability closed the center. So most of the centers in the state of Missouri that were offering pediatric care have ceased to do so because of the extended period of time for liability.
Fascinating. I mean, it's incredible how what seems to be like a small change in legislation.
What is a small change, but also it's interesting for the narrative, because the narrative is these are safe, effective treatments, long-term good care. And if that were the case, then nobody would be afraid of an extended period of time for malpractice.
I read the affidavit you provided to the Missouri AG. It's utterly shocking. And I think we kind of have to start at the beginning. For starters, you were working at this clinic, fully bought into the whole approach at one point. Tell me how you got into this in the first place.
So I've spent years working in roles that are social work roles, so case management roles, working with individuals who are coming into their own for age and learning how to navigate adulthood and being a teen. So I was working with young adults who were HIV positive. And there is a big overlap for some trans people and HIV, particularly trans women, experience high levels of HIV infection. And so I was finding that a lot of the individuals that I were working with were trans-identified. So I became sort of an expert in trans issues within that setting. I was really good at helping people with things like legal name change, gender marker change. I understood these systems. I was looking at resources and, ways to help people. And so this position came up working in the pediatric center. And a number of people came to me and said, you should apply for this. This really seems just something that you would be really good at. And so I applied, I started, that would have been around 2018. The center had only been open for a year. And I was the second person to take the role of the case manager in this center. And really probably only one of two people in the entire state of Missouri to have such a role. And I really did go into this believing that we were going to alleviate suffering and help young people become their truth selves and embody their truth.
That's interesting, right? Because this is the kind of the core idea here behind this, is that if you help young people early to realize they're the opposite sex or something different than their, as what they call assigned at birth, which I find that phraseology, frankly, highly problematic. But yeah, that if you deal with that early, then you'll have a healthy, happy person on the other side. That's the core. So would you agree?
Yeah, that's the core idea behind the whole concept. Yes.
And everything I've been learning and about this over the last several years tells me the opposite is true.
Yes, if you really start to look at where these treatments came from and evolved and how we came to even be interfering in the pediatric body, you start to really question the whole model of care itself. I didn't realize when I started at this center the history of how this developed out of something called the Dutch protocol that came out of the Netherlands, and how truly revolutionary and without a lot of good quality research it was to start blocking puberty in a healthy developing body and go from a puberty blocker to a cross-sex hormone in a pediatric child's body. And as as I worked in the center and as I began to understand more and more not only where this came from, but what we were seeing in the population, so many truths about the treatment, they just weren't holding water.
So one of the things that's in your affidavit is that, I believe, is that in the Dutch model, they excluded young people with these psychiatric comorbidities, whereas in the scenario that you were working, almost every prospective patient had the serious psychiatric comorbidities. Yeah.
Yeah, so the Dutch were excluding individuals with severe or concurrent mental health issues, but they were also excluding patients who did not have lifetime gender dysphoria. So part of their protocol was people had to have been experiencing this condition that we call gender dysphoria from a very, very young age. And what we're seeing in this cohort in the United States is a huge number of, frankly, teenagers who do not have any lifetime or early onset gender issues presenting in these clinics. And there are teens who have learned enough to say, oh, but I have been experiencing this from an early age. But we see this disconnect where they claim this, but there's no real family history. In medicine, you want to not only trust but verify. So if somebody tells me I've had this since I was, my earliest memories, but yet you can find nothing in their medical records. There was nothing where they came to a pediatrician and mom had a conversation with the pediatrician about, I'm concerned about my child's gender presentation, or a kindergarten teacher. There's nothing documenting this. These are really a significant number of teens who are coming forward at 15, 16 with these presentations that we just don't see any history of. And these are patients that were always excluded. These were not patients that were included in these early treatment models.
And with that, we'll be back after a short break.
And we're back with Whistleblower from a Pediatric Transgender Center, Jamie Reed. What were you thinking? You mentioned you believed you were stepping into something that could be helpful, right, to young people, I think. But just explain to me the mental state or the reality or the core assumptions of a person that is involved in this ostensibly in believing they're doing good.
I think there's a number of themes that you see in pediatric gender medicine. So in a number of these centers, these are doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers who really do have strong beliefs about helping young people. They see suffering. A lot of these doctors are young doctors. They're newer in these fields. One of our doctors was directly out of residency, and he was named a co-director. And there is an intentional practice of hiring into these centers of people directly from my community. So they are hiring individuals who are within the LGBT. And that's intentional, and it also creates these feelings where you cannot go against these narratives because you're not just, you're going against your own tribe. You're going against your own people if you step forward and say, I don't see this working the way that it was sold. I see people being harmed. And one of the reasons why there are so many lesbian, gay, bi adults who are working in this field is because so many people experienced gender questioning and confusion as a young person. For so many lesbian, gay, and bi people, it's just part of our growing up. We experience gender in different ways. We are tomboys. We are what used to be referred to as sissy girls. Like we experience gender differently. And part of the problem is we see ourselves in these kids, yet we have no good way of diagnostically differentiating who of these patients would just grow up to be a gay person versus who might experience more of a lifelong gender questioning pathway.
Which for all accounts is extremely rare.
Extremely rare.
Right.
Honestly, if you looked at earlier data, most of these kids are gay kids. And most of the gay community that I struggle with is we are taking away sexual function and fertility from our own selves as younger people. And that's something that is hard to face as an adult who has had biological children, who has been able to find comfort in my own gender and sex. We're taking these decisions and we're taking this away from children.
If there's anything we've learned from the last few years, is this power of social conformity or the power of the need to belong, overcoming, frankly, in a lot of cases, rationality.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm kind of beginning to get a sense of how this works, but the effects, as you pointed out moments ago, on these kids are a life of suffering. I mean, that's not oversimplifying it, is it? Like in many cases.
No. We were not just an ideological bubble, but we were upheld by the university. Our culture right now is upholding places like these as if we are somehow the sacred, the unable to be questioned. We didn't just run the Pediatric Gender Center. We went into the other medical divisions and we had the audacity to go in and train in these other divisions so that they would start to take on the language. In my training, I would directly say, we are not here to be the language police, but you can't say this to your patients. You can't say this to your patients. You have to use whatever pronouns your patients come forward with. You have to change the charts to update how they're identifying. We were going into these medical systems like tentacles and going into them to shift this all across the board. And when we first went and were doing these trainings in 2018, there was no pushback. the audience would be kind of just like, oh, these are, they know everything. They're so great. And by the end of 2022, 2023, other medical professionals were slowly starting to recapture what they already knew. They were starting to push back and ask questions. And they would say, is there a line anywhere? Do we just affirm anything these children are saying? And part of the complicity that I still feel is I feel like we were bullying people into these concepts. It was an ideological bullying across the medical spectrum. And as you pull out of medicine, you see this in the schools and journalism, in peer-reviewed publications. It's everywhere. It's that if you question this, you get to be, you're the worst of the worst. You're transphobic, you're homophobic, you're a Nazi. I mean, it's just, the capture in all of these systems is just remarkable how quickly it occurred.
I'm going to read something that I pulled. The center tells the public and parents that it makes individualized decisions. One would hope, right? This is not true. Doctors at the center believe that every child who meets 4 basic criteria, age or puberty stage, therapist letter, parental consent, and a 1-hour visit with a doctor is a good candidate for irreversible medical intervention. When a child meets these 4 simple criteria, the doctors always decide to move forward with puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones. There were no objective medical tests or criteria or individualized assessments. How is that remotely possible?
Those were some of the basic scientific questions that began to really trouble me. So in medicine, there should be a differential diagnosis done. And everyone presenting cannot, just statistically, cannot come through to the other side meeting the differential. It's almost like if everybody went and said, I have rheumatoid arthritis, and everyone that presented that claimed that they had already diagnosed themselves came out the other side with treatments for rheumatoid arthritis. We had set up a system where children were basically fulfilling the role that we used to give to doctors with training to provide a differential diagnosis. And what was so challenging was that seeing it continue to fall on the kids, because in these rooms, I would watch parents, basically turn to their adolescents who were struggling or in so much distress and basically say to them, you have to be sure about this. Are you really sure? Because this is, and everybody at the end of the day just looked at the kid. And part of what, as a parent, I know makes children even more anxious and struggle even more is when we don't tell them that the adults in the room, we've got this covered. We're the adults. We make the decisions. It is not on your shoulders. And we have created a medical system where we have put all of this on the kids. So then imagine if you're a kid and you say in a room, yes, this is it. I know this is the treatment that I need. And then you find out 2, 3, 4 years later, it's not. There's so much pressure on them to continue because we have allowed them to make that decision, a decision that should never have been theirs in the first place.
Well, there's a incredibly heartbreaking anecdote which you cite, which is the young girl who, asks to have her breasts put back on after double mastectomy. I don't even know what to say about that, but horribly misled and, abused, it comes to mind.
It was a failure on so many individuals going in to allow her to have that surgery. But the thing then that just was such a gut check was on the back end. You have a patient calling within 3 months of surgery reporting this, and the surgeon couldn't even bother to take the call or call them back. The person who actually removed this healthy tissue from the from this person in front of them, couldn't even be bothered to pick up the phone and call them back and hear their pain and acknowledge it. It was pushed off on myself and our nurse to do this follow-up. The hubris, the lack of being willing to see the harm that one did, it's horrible.
What kind of accountability followed this scenario?
There was no accountability. The university, the hospital administrators, there was no accountability. And what made me realize that this was not an individual patient failure, this was a systematic failure, was because this patient met the criteria. I mean, they had a letter from a therapist. They had worked with the therapist ahead of time. They had met what was laid out by what's referred to as WPATH. It just continued to show me that this was the whole machine was broken, not just an individual cog or an individual cog there. It was every element was the only way that the machine could spin was to take someone and put them into the treatment path. And there were no off-ramps at any point.
Well, Jamie Reed, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all for joining Jamie Reed and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.